Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Sunday afternoon Q&A with Ned Thanhouser, and that is about the Thanhouser Corporation. He is in beautiful downtown Portland, and I am in Niles, California, as you can see by my shirt. Well, you couldn't tell that on my shirt, but I could be wearing that anywhere. But anyway, so I have some questions to ask him, but I did want to put in a plug for a couple of different things before we get started. One is we do have a weekend of programs today, and we did just post the Zoom program for the John Marsalis interviews musicians, including Phil Carley and Frederick Hodges and several other folks. That is now live on our website as well as on our YouTube page. I do suggest people look on our website first for everything, because what the web page has is it has context. It has everything laid out nice and cleanly, and there's also some things that are available on our website that are not available on YouTube. YouTube is merely our place to hold all the videos, but our website for our webpage for Bronco Billy Film Festival and Charlie Chaplin Days, as well as this weekend and all future weekends that we're doing programs, we try to put everything in context on one page. So yesterday was the studio musicians Zoom with John Marsalis, and then we also have Tim Lucier's slideshow of classic film magazine covers. And then today, David Keene, our historian, my husband, also did a program on the Great Train Robbery and locations. There's information there about the Edison studio, because we wanted to have kind of a focus on New York and New Jersey film studios for the next couple months. So that's why we have Ned on board here. Please do be on the lookout for the films. There are a couple of films, and Ned will talk more about those, as well as other films available on his website that are available for viewing. And then hopefully you've all seen the documentary, very nice documentary about the Thanhouser Corporation. Now next month, we're going to be having a big push for Biograph and Vitagraph, especially their New York origins. So I'm really excited about that. A lot of fun things will be plugged about that. That'll be the 19th and 20th of September. We are trying to do this now monthly for the time being. It's going to be through the end of the year, I would imagine, at least. But of course, I also want to put in a plug for Cinecon. They're going to be having a few days of programming online. Lots of other film companies or film festivals are having their online programs, as well as places like Pordenone, and then there's a silent comedy watch party that's being done by Steve Massa and Ben Modell out of New York on Sundays. And Retro Format and the Hollywood Heritage are doing programs in Los Angeles. So there's just a lot of content. Carrie Bible is doing these really fun Hollywood Kitchen programs, as well as Hollywood Forever programs. So there's just a lot of silent film entities, things happening online. So be on the lookout for it. You're welcome to send me a message and say, hey, can you tell me those things again? And we'll post them on our Facebook page as well. So we are now at 5:04. It looks like we've got our people. So let's start with our questions. So Ned, hello, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. This is a great time to have a chance while we're all quarantined to connect. It's really a great opportunity. Thank you.
Sure. Well, we've had a relationship for a while with you. You came out and did a program at in Niles. Now, for those that are not familiar, I can't imagine anybody tuning in here not knowing about us, but we are a 100-seat Nickelodeon movie theater located in historic Niles District of Fremont, California, United States. And we are the home of the Niles S&A Silent Film Museum, where we focus on the Western division of the Chicago-based S&A Film Company run by George Spohr and Gilbert Bronco Billy Anderson. And there's some interesting little connections between Thanhouser and S&A, just because the time frame was the same that the film companies were running. But so you came and you did a program with us, and I mentioned earlier before we got started that we have a lovely poster on board on display at our museum on the evidence of the film, the one with Florence Lavigne looking at the film strip. And we absolutely love it because we pair it with, when we talk about Josephine Rector, who was the head scenario writer for several of the years in Niles. And so we're able to talk about how women, there really wasn't the glass ceiling that you think of even nowadays. 100 years ago, it was really the Wild West, as it were, in filmmaking. And women were involved with lots of different parts of it. Maybe not cinematographers, because due to the 75-pound cameras, but just about every other part, they were involved to some degree in filmmaking. And you've screened films, we sell your products in our store. And so we've had this nice connection, and you live in Portland and we visited you there. We got to see some of your original one-sheet posters and such. So we've had this kinship. So it made sense for me to reach out to you to have you be here. You've offered to show the streaming your documentary, your some films. So why don't you tell me about the films that we have available to see on your website? We'll get started with that.
Sure, that'd be great. As you talked about the documentary was completed, I think it was 2010 or 11. Can't remember the exact year. It's kind of a blur. But the documentary runs 52 minutes long. There's a link to watching a free version that's on your schedule page on the Niles website. And you can watch that through midnight tomorrow night. It's normally $5, not a huge fee, but we're making it free for this event. And there's also links on that same scheduling page to two of the short one-reel films that we mentioned in the documentary. One is titled The Evidence of the Film, which is on the National Film Registry as one of the important films in film history. It has filmmaking as its subject in a crime drama. And that film is available year-round, as well as another film that we talk about in the documentary called Petticoat Camp, which more of a women's lib film, an early women's lib film where the women rule the day when the boys and the girls, their wives, go camping. It's a comedy, and I think it's a great one. But on the Thanhouser.org page, that's Thanhouser.org, there's 56 films that you can stream right now anytime for free. There's also links if you want to buy DVDs. There's a dozen Thanhouser film DVDs, plus some other ones, collections from the iFilm Museum. iFilm Museum has a number of films, as well as some treasures that came out of the Library of Congress 2 years ago. So I think that there's a lot of material you can watch, both for free, and if you want to be a collector and have DVDs on your shelf, those are available as well.
That was very generous of you to offer those up. I mean, it's wonderful when people are able to see film in their home that was made, in New York more than 100 years ago, and they can see it on their screen at home.
Yeah.
That's pretty darn exciting. Okay, so I should say, for housekeeping purposes, if folks want to go to speaker view up in the upper right-hand corner, there should be a opportunity to click it. So Ned is the main focus here. But otherwise, it's the kind of, what do they call it, Hollywood Squares or Brady Bunch look, and there's nothing wrong with that either. But just that's one option for you. Okay, so tell me about, how did you discover your family's legacy? I mean, what did you know about it ever since you were a child? I mean, tell me about how that all came about, because it seems like it was a discovery.
It was a discovery. My father told me and my two sisters growing up that my grandparents, his parents, were in the film business in the early era of cinema, but he didn't save any of the films, and all of that material was gone.
Oh.
And so I grew up thinking that all the Thanhouser films were gone. And in fact, my grandfather, Edwin, did burn all of the negatives. He thought it was too expensive to keep them, and he thought they weren't worth anything. And in fact, there's a quote that we have. He thought they were worthless, burn them. And so the negatives were all burned. But we figured out after my father passed away that for every negative, you had 30 or 40 prints that went into distribution. And it was those distributions of prints that went all over the world. I have found films not only here at the Library of Congress, which has the largest collection, but at the George Eastman House, Museum of Modern Art, the I Film Museum over in the Netherlands, the British Film Institute, even in New Zealand and Australia, we have found films. And I even know of one film that's in the Russian archive. I was sent an enter title for one of the films we already had a copy of, but the title was in Cyrillic characters. So obviously the Thanhouser films have made their trip around the globe. And to date, the Thanhouser company made over 1,000 films between their release dates from 1910 to 1917. They made 1,000 films, over 1,000. So that's over 2.5 films a week, which is quite prolific. And of those 1,000+ films, I found 260 surviving prints with my research with archives over the past 30 years. And the big challenge for me has been getting copies of those films from the archives. Not only is it expensive and time consuming to get digital copies made, but when the archives release the films, they're in the public domain, they've lost all control. So I've spent years, decades, establishing relationships with archives to gain access to those films. And it's been very rewarding that I've been able to do that.
I mean, do they end up like contacting you saying, hey, we came across another Thanhouser? Not like that.
Very rarely. I have to go on periodic searches. In fact, a couple of years ago, I managed to set up a visit with my friend Bryony Dixon, who is the silent film curator at the British Film Institute. And I had met her years before, and I had set up a meeting with her. And I said, well, have you got anything new? And so she brought out like 12 films. Oh, yeah, we've got all these films. I mean, they get films. Their job is to preserve and catalog. It doesn't seem to be in their roundhouse, if you will, to call me to say, oh, we found another film. Every once in a while, I get a call. Jack Theekson, he called me once and found a film. And I got a call from Serge Bromberg at Lobster, and I got a film from him as well. So it's very rare that people will call me. I have to continuously go back to the archives and say, if you got anything new? And sometimes they do, most of the times they don't.
Well, I'd imagine, yeah, having those things surface, it can be a pretty rare thing. Okay, so let's see. I had a couple of questions here. How many of the, okay, so you said of the 1,000 films that survived, you said 250 you've come across, 256?
It's a little over 260 right now. There's some duplicate prints in there. For example, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was one of the films they did in 1912. Very popular film. There's 8 copies of that film. Everything from 8mm film that was distributed by Blackhawk, 16mm print that I obtained a copy of, and there's some 35 prints. Cinderella, another popular film. There's 7 copies of that film at different archives. But other films, like The Evidence of the Film, one of the ones that we're going to talk about, there's 1 copy. It's 35mm, and it was found in 1999 on the floor of a projection booth in Superior, Wisconsin. A team had gone in to decommission the theater and take out the projector and all the equipment. And they saw this can of film on the floor, so they picked it up and, they held it up to the light. And between the perfs, it said Thanhouser, between the perfs. And so they used the miracle of the internet and typed in Thanhouser and found my website, contacted me. It was a 35mm nitrate print, been sitting on the floor since 1912. And we got them to ship it to the Library of Congress. Library of Congress preserved that film. And that film was nominated by the Library of Congress and is now on the National Film Registry as one of the 25 films in the year it was nominated. So it's an important film from film history. It shows, women doing all the work in the back room, which I think is important. Plus it shows the operation inside of the film factory, which is of interest to historians as well.
That's just, that's one of those stories, right? You know, down the bottom on the floor of a theater. Oh my gosh. Okay, so then of those films, so there's that. So actually, it seems like a pretty good percentage per se. I mean, 260 out of 1,000, considering some of them. I mean, we have what 350 films are made in Niles, and I think we have access. Maybe there's 50 bits, 50 of them with 70 of them with fragments and all that, not full things. So it seems like that's a pretty good thing. So I'm going to ask an esoteric question here.
Yeah.
Some of the people involved in this audience like esoteric. So when they were renting these films out, did they have their own rental exchange? Because I got interested in that a little bit because the Chicago studios, the S&A Film Studios with George Spohr, he started kind of, I like to say that he started Netflix. I mean, that's not accurate, but he started a rental exchange, and he realized that got the more films out and more people happy because they didn't have to buy a film and then try to trade it with other people. They were able to do an exchange. So I never even knew about such a thing before getting involved with our film museum. And I know that also they were part, and Thanhouser wasn't part of the patents company, right? Or they were?
They were not. Edwin applied for a license when he was starting the business in 1909. Thomas Edison basically said, you have no experience making films, you don't have a studio or the equipment, so he was denied. But that didn't stop him. He went out and got Italian-made Bianchi cameras and hired people that knew how to run and do that film work. But in terms of your question regarding distribution, Thanhouser went through distributors, for sure. They didn't do any direct to theater or sell the films. They sold the films to distributors who then routed them through theaters for rental. And if you look at Moving Picture World, which is one of the contemporary publications, it was an industry-focused publication. Between 1910 and 1916, the Thanhouser Studio owned the inside front cover of that publication. So every issue of the Moving Picture World, when you opened it up during that period, you'd see the Thanhouser advertisement.
Wow. All right. So, and just to let everybody know, do type in your questions in the chat box in case you have, we'll get to them because we're doing this a little interview here, but we will get to your questions. So I know part of it is there's a lot of people that have basic knowledge of the different film companies and things. And then I know there's some folks that are viewing this right now and will be viewing this that are, they dive deep. So that's why I thought I'd ask questions about everything down to rentals. Okay, so Florence Lavigne, what a beauty. Oh my gosh. So how do you think she's remembered today? I mean, what was she like then? How was she promoted? And then what would you say? And then she died so young.
Yeah, it's a tragic story. And but I think it has a memorable ending. Florence got into the movies because she was a friend of Mary Pickford. And Mary Pickford invited her to come to Biograph, where Mary was working under D.W. Griffith, and Florence was given a couple of roles by D.W. Griffith, and he directed her in the 1910 timeframe. But I think Florence saw the fact that Mary was going to be the star, and Florence knew she wasn't going to become the star compared to Mary. So she went to Edwin Thanhouser, who had a studio in New Rochelle, and applied to Edwin in 1911, and he hired her right away. And so Florence became the most popular and highly publicized actress at the Thanhouser Studio. She was in over 160 films. There are over a dozen of her surviving films that you can watch online today. If you go to the Thanhouser.org website and you go to the Florence Lavigne biography page, there are links to all 12 of her surviving films. And so she was the big star at Thanhouser. Was all these films, was highly promoted. You know, I don't know if you've seen these card decks that they have, playing cards. Mm-hmm. And there are 52 cards, and every card had the picture of one of the stars on them. Well, guess who was the ace of spades? The highest ranked card in the deck was Florence Lavigne, and that kind of gives you an idea of how she stood in that era. But in 1917, she and her boyfriend Goodman were driving. Well, she was actually driving the car in Ossining, New York, and she was coming down a steep hill, and she lost control of the car. Car crashed. They were both thrown out, but she had a broken pelvis and internal injuries. Goodman had a broken leg, but she went to the hospital, and she died 6 weeks later of septicemia, which is blood poisoning.
Oh.
So it was a horrible death. Now, Florence was not born as a Labadie. Her birth name was Russ, Florence Russ. But she was given up for adoption by her mother. Her father had passed away, and her mother was indigent and couldn't take care of Florence. So she's put up for adoption at age 3. We have all these adoption papers. And a wealthy couple from Montreal, the Labadies, adopted Florence, and so she took on the name Florence Lavigne. But when she passed, she was buried in the Russ family plot at the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. But she was in an unmarked grave. So for 100 years, almost 100 years, her grave was unknown. There wasn't even a footstone or anything. And so I learned about that, and I worked with the people at the Greenwood Cemetery and raised over $6,000 from fans. And we put up a headstone for her several years ago. And we had 100 people show up for the unveiling of the headstone. And then we showed some films of her.
Wow.
It was great. So if you go to the Florence Lavigne biography page on the Thanhouser.org site, there's all the information on what I've just told you in much greater detail. I've given presentations at numerous conferences, the Women in the Silent Film Conference, the Cinema and Media Studies Conference, SCMS. So there's a lot of information about her biography and how she's currently remembered.
Well, that's great. I think it's always wonderful to bring people, well, I don't want to say back to life because that doesn't sound right, but bring it to people's collective knowledge. I mean, to know who she was, again, so many years after her passing.
So, Raina?
Yes, sir.
There's a question that just came up that I'd like to answer on the chat from Karen. Karen, thank you for your question, number one. Yeah, the book you're talking about is called Stardust and Shadows, I believe, by a guy named Charles Foster. And he makes a chapter on Florence where he says she had an affair with Woodrow Wilson and bore his illegitimate child. Great story. It's not true. I did extensive research on her whereabouts and have disproved his statements that were all from his memory 40, 50 years ago when he was a young man, that Florence was impregnated by Wilson and had his child. Again, if you go to the Florence Lavigne page on my website, if you just go to Thanhouser.org and search for Florence Lavigne, you'll find it. There is a very, very detailed academic paper that has all of the facts as opposed to hearsay and rumor from Mr. Foster about Florence's life that disproves this chapter in his book that she had this affair with Wilson. So I think that
was the Canadian Hollywood Babylon then, huh?
Yeah, that's what it was.
Well, I know sometimes real life is just not quite as interesting as what people like to make up or sounds like a good story. Okay, so another question I had was, tell me about James Cruz. And he, in 1915, he was quite known.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? My earphones are kind of breaking up. Maybe I have to change earphones. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine, no problem.
Okay, Fine, then I'll continue. Yeah, James Cruz was another one of the Thanhouser hires. He came on to Thanhouser in 1911, about the same year as Florence Lavigne. And he was paired with Florence in many films. Probably one of the most famous pairings was in the Thanhouser production of David Copperfield, which is a surviving print. It's on three one-reel films that we put together. It's held in a museum in Italy. And I was able, after 10 years of negotiation, to get that film busted loose, thanks to my friends at the Pordenone Silent Film Festival, mainly David Robinson helped with that. So I was able to get access to the film, and James Cruz and Florence Lavigne are paired in that film. It's quite in 1911, so it's early in their career. But they both went on to do many films together, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's another film where they're paired. But James Cruz went on. He married one of the other Thanhouser actresses, Marguerite Snow, and he and Marguerite Snow sought a big raise and more recognition in 1915. And Edwin Thanhouser said, "You're getting too big for your britches," and he fired him. And they sent him out to California. And James Cruz went on to become one of the highest paid directors in Hollywood at the time. He was making $10,000 a week, and he produced the first full-scale feature Western film called The Covered Wagon, which you can still get on VHS. At least I had a copy.
And even DVD. All right, great. So let's see. Want to make sure I get any questions. Let's take a look and see if anybody has. So we say there's a question here from Ikbra about films made on location in Florida. Are there any films that were made in location in Florida that still exist, and what are those films? And we'll give you a minute.
Yeah, okay. I think my earbuds may be running out of juice, but the answer is yes. There were films that were made in Florida. I don't have a comprehensive list in front of me, but there are films that were made in Florida. I'm trying to think of, it's mainly in Jacksonville. If you, can I post comments after we're done with this? Or,
sure.
Or Karen, if you want to send me an email, I can give you a list of the films. I just don't have that in front of me or at the top of my head. But yes, there are films that were made in Florida that still survive.
And why don't you tell them what your very easy email address is?
And my email is really easy. It's Ned, N-E-D, @thanhouser.org. So send me an email and I'll do that for you.
And it's on your website as well, of course. Okay, so what would you say are the most famous films produced by the studio, and can we see them now?
Yeah, I think the most famous films are the two that are on the National Film Registry. One, of course, is The Evidence of the Film, which we've talked about. And then the other one is a two-reel film that was done in 1912 called The Cry of the Children. That film is on the National Film Registry as well. So there's two Thanhouser films that have been placed on the film registry. And those are probably two of the most famous films because, number one, the first one is a story about film in film, using film as a plot device. And the second one goes back to 1912 when you had the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that hundreds of women that were in a building where the doors were locked were killed, and they went on strike. And the Cry of the Children is basically about child labor in the factories and the implications of that, and how the star of the film, little Marie Eline, goes to the factory to take the place of her mother who is ill, and she is worked literally to death, and it's a very sad film.
I can attest to the fact that it's a very moving film. We actually had for a couple of years there, we were part of Labor Fest, which was a focus on labor and unions and things like that, and that was one of our featured films. And I'd say that people were just really blown away.
It's a very moving film for sure. I mean, it really shows the compassion that today and back then that, this child labor was just wrong. And it brought greater attention to that issue in its day. And it actually led to some reforms from Roosevelt at the time. Teddy.
Okay, well, I'm going to try an experiment here. If someone has a question that they would like to ask on screen, they can unmute themselves and ask the question. I don't know if we have too many questions. I got one question left for Ned, but I wanted to give the opportunity if somebody wanted to say hello and ask a question of him, they can do that now. So is there anybody who'd like to take us up on that? I'm going to give you a few seconds. Going once. All right, so my question to you then, Ned, is do you have any upcoming projects or current projects that you'd like to share?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I do. For the past, I guess, 10 years, I've been reaching out to more archives to try to get additional films. And I have a new DVD project that is what we call volumes 13, 14, and 15, because there's so many films, I need 3 discs to put them on.
Wow.
There's 19 films that are newly released. They're mostly, I think they're all one-reel films. Many come from the British Film Institute. Some are from the Academy Film Archive at the Motion Picture Academy Arts and Sciences. There's one there. There's one from UCLA. There's some from the Library of Congress. So there's a couple of documentaries on there. There was a terrible flood that happened in 1911 in Austin, Pennsylvania. There was a dam that was built, poorly constructed by a paper mill, and they had a big rain and the dam failed, and it was 1 mile above the city of Austin, and 250 million gallons of water came down onto the city and destroyed it and killed over 78 of its people. And the Thanhouser company went there the day after the flood, and they have, if you will, documentary footage of the aftermath. So that's one of the films on there. The other 2 films that are basically the headliners are based on plays by Henrik Ibsen, if you know Ibsen plays. One is called The Pillars of Society, and the other one's called A Dollhouse, which is a women's liberation film, if you know the story of The Doll's House. And both of those films have got an audio commentary track by a scholar from the Norway Film Museum.
Wow.
Erik Frishold Hensen did a commentary track. So you can watch it with or without. But those films, all 19 of them, will be released on DVD in October this year in conjunction with the Pordenone Silent Film Festival. And they will also be available for rent online for $1.99 each, or you can rent them all for $20. So again, I'm trying to recover some costs. I spent over $10,000 on music and transfers and all that stuff. So, getting these films and making the DVDs is not cheap. But so trying to do some cost recovery. I'll never get it all back. It's an act of love to get these films out. So that's the next project, the Thanhouser Collection, volumes 13, 14, and 15. It'll be available on DVD and online in October.
Yes, I think if you want to preserve silent films, it's got to be love, because I'm not seeing anybody thinking they're going to hit the mother lode by being involved with with that production. It's nice if you can get back your costs, but even that can be rare as well.
Agreed.
All right. Well, we're at the 33-minute mark, and I don't see any more questions coming in. Do we have any? Oh, hold on. I got a question from David. Yes.
How did he find his grandfather's scrapbook?
How did you find your grandfather's scrapbook?
That's interesting. That was one of the family memorabilia items that my dad had. And there was very little reference in there to the film business. I did have some of their travel books. After they retired in the 20s, they traveled all over the world. And I've digitized those. They're online as well. But the scrapbook was one of those, memorabilia items that was in my family, but very little reference in there to his time as a film producer. My father wrote a monograph about the family history, and he was born in 1905, so he was, like 10 years old by the time, 10 or 11 years old during the height of the production, and he remembered what it was like to see the production in New Rochelle, because he grew up in New Rochelle. And his memories are quite vivid, and we have an audio recording. He did an oral history, and that was very helpful. So that's that. So the scrapbook is basically, some memorabilia, a little bit about the film enterprise.
Got another one.
Okay, we got another question here. Yes.
Did his grandparents appear in any Thanhouser films?
Did your grandparents appear in any Thanhouser films?
Excellent question. Answer is yes. Gertrude, who bore two children, my father Ed Lloyd and his sister Marie, and she had been on the stage as a young ingenue, and was very popular. If you go to the New York Public Library, there's lots of pictures of her on the stage, and she was very famous as Little Gertie Homan. Her maiden name was Homan. Her name was Gertrude, but she went by Gertie. And when they started the business, she was more behind the camera than in front of the camera, but she decided to be in one of the early productions. And when she saw herself on the screen, she said, "My time on the stage and before the camera is over." So she was in one film.
Oh.
And Edwin was an extra in one or two films. There's one film we have a still image of where he is an usher at a theater. That's it. So I wouldn't have any footage of either of them.
Wow, that's too bad. Any
Yeah.
other questions? Okay. I got my own peanut gallery over here.
Right.
Nothing wrong with that. Okay, so we have a question here. Were the personnel at Thanhouser aware of other studios' movies, and were they well, I would just imagine they were, and were they striving to compete?
Absolutely. It was a very competitive time, as you probably know, in the 1910 frame. We had the Motion Picture Patents Company, and there was, 10? David, how many were there?
There were 10.
10, yeah, 10. There were 10 companies, Lubin and all the other, Edison and SNA, yeah, all those guys. Yeah. They were certainly dominant, and that was Edison's strategy, was to dominate and keep the money to himself and not let anybody else in. But there were other independent theaters besides Thanhouser, and if you take a look at any of the publications from the day, you can see, especially if you go to Moving Picture World, which is available online, all the copies, you will see dozens and dozens of competing companies. I mean, it was like having 40 different Starbucks brands out there on every corner. Everybody had their idea of how to make a movie, and it was a time where everybody was this Wild West trying to get out there and make movies and make money, because if you make the movie once, you show up for many times with a nickel a viewer. It became a really lucrative financial endeavor. So it was very competitive, and the studio was definitely aware of the competitive nature of the industry at the time.
I mean, I'm not gonna be defending the patents company. I can appreciate, though, the thought that they wanted to have high quality productions and all of that, using good equipment and such, because there were some, I guess, questionable processes that are being used. But at the same time, it just sounds like it was a really tough time, because they were really trying to dominate. And if you were not one of their group, you really had it tough. So Theodore asked the question, did Thanhouser have to deal with strong arm tactics used by some of the other companies?
Yes, they did. As you probably know, Edison and his thugs, I'll call them, would go around, and they saw you using an Edison camera without a patent, they'd take their baseball bats out. And actually, the research that was done by a gentleman named David Bowers, who wrote the encyclopedia on Thanhouser, which is online on the Thanhouser site. He actually obtained investigative reports from the Edison company when they would go spy on Thanhouser and shooting. And they would disrupt the shooting schedule when Thanhouser was out making pictures. So yeah, the thugs were there using their heavy-handed techniques. And as you probably know, that was one of the reasons that the industry moved from the East Coast to the West. I mean, besides the better weather and terrain, people were trying to get away from Edison and his strong arm tactics.
So why didn't Thanhouser do that?
Well, in 1917, well, first off, Edwin liked the West Coast, East Coast. I mean, he was ensconced there. He didn't want to move, and he had made quite a bit of money. And I think that to him, it was a business. It wasn't like he's going to be an artist his whole life making movies and move to California and become a mogul. That wasn't his motivation from what we can tell. So in 1917, the industry was going into recession. The World War was taking away all of the international revenues. And the industry was moving from the East Coast to the West Coast. And he had a contract with Mutual that had purchased the studio to run the Thanhouser studio for 3 years. That contract was up, and he said, I'm done, and retired in his 50s, never worked another day, and collected Barbizon era art. That was his retirement.
Wow.
Which I've tried to find some of the pieces he owned. I took the catalog to Sotheby's in New York once, saying, because he sold all of his paintings. And I said, do you have any of these paintings? Where can I find them? And, a guy named Benjamin Dollar, I think he was their big appraiser. He came down and looked at the catalog, and he points at, that one's $1 million, that's $2 million, that's $3 million. I'm not going to buy any of those. But he had quite an eye for this era for art.
Wow. So there was a question. Sounds like some of these have been already been kind of answered. You said that your grandparents went traveling. Did they travel all over the place? What else did they do after retiring? Anything else that you want to share?
Well, yeah, they spent time in the winters going to Florida. They were big Florida fans, and they did these round the world cruises, and they did that at least twice. And I have, again, picture scrapbooks from their travels around the world. But they built a house out on Long Island, and then when they were older, they moved to an apartment on Fifth Avenue.
Okay. Well, so they were right in the middle of the action.
Yeah.
Okay, so a question about the Thanhouser production of Tannhauser. Do you think the family name suggested the choice of the subject, and anything more you'd like to share about the film and its recovery?
Well, the film does exist, and it was shot in California. Thanhouser went out for less than a year in rented facilities in California, and James Cruz and Florence Lavigne are in that film. I think it's a two-reeler, and don't know much about the production other than it's very well staged. It's for the era. There's some pretty risque shots of women in gauzy outfits and everything. You can kind of get an idea that the audience was wide-eyed on some of that. But in terms of the name, Tannhauser versus our family name, Thanhouser, who knows? I mean, Edwin and Gertrude were great readers of plays and stories and productions, and so they may have just looked at this and said, this is another opportunity to take a classic novel or play and bring it to the screen. That would be my guess.
But the connection with the name being kind of similar might have attracted them. Who knows?
It might have, but we don't know.
Okay, we have another question here. Did the company run into trouble during World War I due to the German name?
Not that I know of. I don't think so. Again, my guess is that when they came over from my great-grandfather, came over in the 1840s to escape persecution. They were Jewish. And our family guess is the name was Thanhouser. And it was changed by the immigration officials saying you can't have two N's in a row or something. And, I mean, our best guess is that, Thanhouser, basically the Tan is like Tannenbaum, it's like pine, and Haus is house. So we're thinking pine, house in the woods, or builder of pine houses, or maybe he made coffins. I don't know, little houses.
Gee.
We don't know.
Goodness. All right. Well, why don't you tell the group that little connection? There's that little connection with the Chicago SNA studio and the Thanhouser folks.
You're going to have to tell that one. I can't recall all that.
Oh no,
Oh, David. Yeah, you stumped me on that one. I know there was some connection, but I don't know the details.
Temple, the Bush Temple Theater.
Oh, the Bush Temple one. Yeah. Well, before Edwin got into the film business, he was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, running the Academy Theater for the Schubert brothers. This is the 1890s. And in 1909, after running this theater in Milwaukee for a decade, he wanted to move to a bigger playing field. And so he went to and leased the Bush Temple Theater in Chicago. And I think he saw the writing on the wall. His revenues were going down. These newfangled motion pictures were taking away all of his nickels. And so I think that's the connection. And they weren't in that Bush Temple Theater very long, less than a year. And then he went to New York and researched the motion picture industry, and the rest is history.
Well, but who took over the lease? That's where the connection is. So
Oh, it is. So SNA took it over. I'm lost
yes,
on this one.
PM Anderson actually took over the lease. That's the connection. So we
That's
have
the connection.
a direct Thanhouser to Chicago SNA connection. So that's the
great.
yes. Whoopee! Who
Yeah,
knew?
that's great.
All right. So I think we're going to be pulling this.
We got one more question here.
Oh, we do. We do. Okay. I thought
Yeah.
we answered just about
From
everything.
Dan. He says a lot of operas were filmed in those days. Also Shakespeare.
Oh,
Well,
it is good.
Fanhauser did 3 or 4 Shakespeare plays, starting with Winter's Tale, which is extant. It's available online. And they also did Romeo and Juliet. Unfortunately, only reel 2 of Romeo and Juliet survives.
Well, we know how that ends. But anyway,
Yeah. Yeah. So, but they did a number of Shakespearean plays. And they also did, they were big on classics. They did this, what's the one? Picture of Dorian Gray, which is available on DVD. And it's a great tale. And, David Copperfield, which is Dickens. They also did Nicholas Nickleby. So they were big fans of classic literature and realizing those on the screen, as well as doing, invented dramas and comedies. Half of their films were dramas. About a quarter to a third were comedies. The rest were, other genres.
well, I think that's the part that we're excited about, connecting with your organization, because the teams are really kind of limited in the representation. There's a lot of focus on the early parts of filmmaking, and then of course the 20s, the heyday, the jazz era, what have you, the production levels being so high, right up there with the early talkies, but that teen era isn't focused on quite as much. And so you focus on that era, and we focus on that era, so that's the other extra connection for us.
It's great.
All right, well, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And again, I encourage everybody, if you go to the schedule link that's on the Niles website, there's a link to the Thanhouser documentary that basically gives, I think, a really great overview of the studio. It's an award-winning film. It's won a number of awards. And it's only 52 minutes, so, it's one glass of wine. And or a cup of coffee, take your pick. And then there's links to those two films we talked about that you can watch complete, The Evidence of the Film and Petticoat Camp, which are two of my favorites. And again, if you want to see more films, there's 56 of them online on the Thanhouser site. And there's DVDs that you can acquire that have the documentary or all these films. You can own them, as well as other films like David Copperfield and Nicholas Nickleby, and a bunch of films that came out of the Netherlands and British Film Institute and Library of Congress. So there's lots of material to keep you busy during these chaotic times. So hopefully you'll enjoy them.
Great. And this talk will be available on our website soon, and then also on our YouTube channel. So
Correct.
Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Ned. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Dan Kamen, for helping us with the housekeeping. All right. So we'll see you soon.
Thank you for having me.